It started at Belbaxter, where I was a pupil, and there's an interesting story here. At that time, you sat an exam called the qualification, the quali, right, the 11 plus, right. So if you were an A1 or an A2 person, then you did Latin and French and all these things. A3, you were sent to do technical and all the rest of it. And what I was told in primary 7 was that if you got an A1 or an A2, you played rugby, and otherwise you played football. And I'd been playing football for the YM at the time. I was playing on the wing, and I was pretty good. And I actually didn't want to pass my quali because I wasn't very keen to play rugby. However, I was inspired by the PE teacher, a guy called Jock Blair, who was an outstanding teacher. He was an inspiration, and I discovered not that long ago, in fact I was in the Athletes Village during the Commonwealth Games, where a girl called Gina Logan, who was in my class, who was also a PE teacher, told me that 6 people from that class had all ended up being PE teachers. And so there's almost an influence in somebody's life, and I think Jock Blair, certainly for me in terms of playing rugby, set that off. Someone who didn't want to play rugby because, you know, he was football daft, and my dad was secretary of the local football club and all the rest of it. I started playing rugby because of him, and I started off at scrum half because he had a very interesting method of selection, right? The wee boys stood at one end of the line and the big boys at the other end of the line. So the weeest boy was a 9 and the biggest guy was a second row, and that's how it started. And that started me. And he was also a member of the Howe of Fife Rugby Club, and so from a very, very early age I got really interested in the Howe as well, and in fact I used to sneak up with my kit, and if he wasn't there, because he didn't like us playing for the club, if he wasn't there I would play for the thirds. When I was 14, I lied about my age, but I got into trouble eventually from him for playing for the Howe. But that's what started it.
How much of a role model, how much of an influence was that kind of Jock Blair scenario for you? And did you consciously seek at any point to emulate that in the way that you interacted with your own players?
Well, he was the inspiration to start with, and as I went through school, I decided fairly early on, maybe in the end of my 4th year, 5th year, I wanted to be a teacher. And maybe that had something to do with his influence, probably did, but I wanted to teach, really keen to teach. And so I went to PE college 1966 to 69, and the influence of rugby was even greater there because Bill Dickinson was there. Now, Bill Dickinson at that time was not the coach, he was the advisor to the captain, right? Because, you know, being the coach at that time meant that you were professional. So if you think about the influence that Jock Blair had on me as a young pupil, and then going into Jordan Hill, and then being tutored, coached by Bill Dickinson, that was an added influence, if you like, and I mean, I was playing alongside people like Ian McLaughlin, for example, Richie Dixon. Dixon and Easson were adjacent to each other in our lockers, you see, so we had a bit of an influence on each other too. Bill Dickinson was an outstanding teacher and coach as well. I mean, he was very innovative. Jordan Hill College played in red jerseys, and there was a research paper way back there that said that red was actually a better colour to see, so therefore he made sure that you know, so that kind of learnings even then. So I was very lucky to get that level of influence from a teacher and a coach like Bill Dickinson. So yeah, huge amount of experience from these people. And if you couple that with teaching practice in the Gorbals, and the Alan Glens, and it was 3 years of a lot of hands-on teaching. So I believe I came out of that period of time with a huge amount of experience in dealing with people, which is fascinates me, always has fascinates me, and in fact, you know, we coach people. We don't coach rugby, or we don't coach bullfighting or high jumping. We coach people, and so I think that was an influence, and I think that had a lot of bearing in the way in which I've coached over the last few years.
Specifically looking at North and Midlands, you were saying you first coached North Midlands in 1988, and North and Midlands were kind of regarded, I suppose, as
we were the Cinderella.
Cinderella, that was the phrase. The Cinderella
yeah.
of the district scene, and when the Scottish Accies came in, that maybe further cemented that label in certain people's minds. But my recollection of North and Midlands was that you maybe didn't always win games, but you played some very, very attractive, positive rugby.
We did. There's two things there. I think one was the culture.
Yeah.
And you say, well, how do you build a culture with such a far-flung community, disparate group, if you like? Yeah. Well, we had guys who travelled from Highland, and at that time Highland was a strong team in Aberdeen. So we tended to meet in Perth. It was fairly central, if you liked, and we changed the way that we did things. So we didn't have the benefits of training maybe twice or three times a week as Edinburgh, Glasgow, maybe even the South had. So we would train on a Wednesday night, but sometimes we wouldn't start till 7:30, 8 o'clock at night because guys had to come to travel. And we would do our trainings, and then they had to travel away again. But the fact that they did that just really cemented a lot of people. And then what we did was we also trained on the Friday night before the game. Now it wasn't massive, but we would pull people in, and we actually stayed in a hotel. Unheard of, but it was like so. But this is what we did, and so that was the I suppose that was the the cultural side of things, and we were up against some pretty formidable teams. A squad of 22. I remember we would have Brian Edwards, B cap. I can still remember playing the South at Mayfield, and it was Brian Edwards, B cap, and the rest were club. Henry Edwards, Alloa, and Ian Rankin, Howe of Fife, and all that kind of stuff. And the South had 21 out of 22 cap players. Yeah. So my philosophy was, if you got the ball in the hands, you're attacking, and so we played an attacking style, and it sounded a bit kind of laissez-faire. It wasn't. We worked very hard on scrum and channel one ball, so we weren't under pressure. But players were given that license to run, and I can still remember playing Australia at Mayfield, and we took 3 tries off Australia, and one of the tries was a scrum underneath our post, and 7 passes later Brian Edwards scored against Australia. And when I was interviewed for the Edinburgh job, I asked for I needed it was a VHS, there wasn't any digital stuff at that time. I had a VHS tape, and I started off my interview by saying, my philosophy is if the ball's in your hands, you're attacking. And I illustrated that with the try that we scored against Australia, and basically said, go on then, ask me questions.